We have a question about grief. Someone has experienced a lot of loss. Recently, quite a number of painful losses from close family members to even pets. And then struggling with the very strong emotions and not being able to overcome that by just reflecting on impermanence. And then also the question, how does that relate to what scientists saying about the brain? And recently some author is describing how grief is physically changing the brain. Maybe starting with the question of the brain, Nama Rupa, the body and mind, they always go closely together, and you will find that virtually all mind states will also then have effects on the brain. But not just the brain, they will also have effects on the body and on the hormones and on body temperature and subtle effects on electroconductivity in the skin and whatnot. So it is completely normal and usually always the case that when you have a certain mind state and you change a mind state or mind state becomes very strong, that this will also physically affect what's happening in the brain, and not just the brain, other parts of the body. But that doesn't mean that you can't work with your mind to change it, because it goes in both directions. So the moment when you can let go in your mind, then as a result of that there will also be changes in the brain. So I wouldn't see that as a discouragement in any which way. Although there's a physiological change in the brain due to strong grief, that doesn't mean now you can't do anything. But when you continue contemplating impermanence and developing letting go, then these changes will also occur. And I think it wouldn't help too much to go into the details of the neurological changes, because how you're going to influence that. I would recommend to work mostly with what you can actually really directly experience, and that is a mind. The first thing I would recommend, don't be upset or disappointed with you that you have that strong grief and that you can't overcome it. There is no reason to blame you or no reason to think that you're not practicing properly. And when you lose a parent and then additionally all these other things, even if you have been practicing the Dhamma for a long time, even if you try to contemplate impermanence, it may not be so easy to overcome that grief. So a good one is simply also just acknowledge. Not to deny, not to suppress, but first of all to simply just acknowledge there's this very strong emotion. And then not to blame you for that. And not to have no aversion. But accepting this is what it is, like Luang Por Sumedho's teaching. That this is what really heavy grief feels like. And this is what your heart is experiencing. And although you have been a Buddhist and you're practicing, right now you couldn't quite overcome that. But on the other hand, you also don't know, it might have been worse if you hadn't done these contemplations. And if you hadn't done your Buddhist practice beforehand. So acknowledging without being judgmental about yourself, without having too much demands as a good Buddhist, I should see the impermanence and I shouldn't be grieving, and then you get the anger on top of it. The next one, you can contemplate impermanence regarding the external phenomena. Now, all these loved ones are also impermanent. One day I will lose them. Now, that is focused on the external. But you can also just internally look at the emotions you experience. And they are also impermanent. And this may be a little bit easier and more relieving. Because as you pointed out, now you already have this shock, and then when you start contemplating everyone I love who is still there, one day I will lose them as well, and then it may become even more overwhelming. And one has to acknowledge that the contemplation of impermanence can be very scary. If it's just a mental exercise, and then mental gymnastics, it may not do much. But if you really go into that, it can be very, very scary, whether you had grief or not. But if you already had that grief, then maybe too much. And the contemplation that you lose these other loved ones, if it's not yet leading to letting go, then it may increase your anxiety. On the other hand, I don't think it's very scary to imagine that the grief you experience is impermanent. Because the impermanence of pain, the impermanence of grief, when it comes to an end, it is obviously uplifting. So maybe rather than contemplating impermanence of these external persons, contemplating and just reminding yourself that whatever pain you go through right now, whatever grief you have there, cannot last forever, is also impermanent. And I think that will be easier to lead to an uplifting and letting go kind of experience. You can think of grief you have earlier experienced years ago, and then you will be able to remember that it did go away. You may not have had it so heavy as now, but I'm pretty sure from your years which you have lived, there will be instances where you had strong sadness, grief, and when you remember, and then you remember that sometime later and it would go away, then that can help you to see also the current mind state as impermanent. And even if it doesn't lead yet to letting go, just reminding oneself, always reminding. Because every strong emotion has a quality that it makes itself appear as if it's forever. It always feels like this is not going to change, subjectively. So it's good not to hold against that. So first, not just fighting, blaming, but acknowledging, okay, this is what it's like. Now I have these big losses, and now this is this feeling of grief, and not to blame yourself. Second, when you do the impermanence contemplation, not just the external persons, but for your mind. Because if you experience pain or grief, then impermanence is on our side. Usually contemplating impermanence is scary because the losing loved ones is tough. Or contemplating that the happiness I have is impermanent is not a necessarily nice contemplation. Contemplating that the pain is impermanent, that's immediately uplifting. And the third thing is going back on saddha, faith, because now you have an idea what the Buddha actually talked about. We all know Four Noble Truths, and the Buddha talked about dukkha, suffering, cause of suffering, the way to the overcoming the cause, and then the end of the cause and the end of suffering. And then we can discuss whether suffering is a good translation or whether dukkha can be translated with stress or pain or whatever. This is just the mental gymnastics. But to remind yourself what you are feeling, this pain, this grief, this is exactly what the Buddha means. And when he talks about the Four Noble Truths and about the end of suffering, it's directly about that. It's not some theory, it's not some sutta with your chanting. It's not some Pali words or English words. It's exactly about that awful pain which you have in your heart. And this is why he went out in the full moon night and renounced. This is why he was starving himself till he almost died, to conquer that, to find an escape from that. And this is exactly what he defeated under the Bodhi tree, when he found the end and escape from all suffering. And this is what he shared. And although you have not been able fully to do that yet, but the Buddha knows exactly what you feel, or he knew exactly what you feel, and he succeeded in finding the way of coming out of that. Because to me, whenever there's great suffering, either internally or externally, just having compassion with other beings, for me it's always giving me a boost in terms of faith. And you realize this is why the Buddha talked about something so unpleasant. Because usually when you start talking about suffering, the people are not so keen on that. In fact, one of the most senior monks in our tradition, Ajahn Dhammasiha, the next senior after Ajahn Sumedho, in the Western monks of Ajahn Chah, and he got a OBA for his work in prison. He's teaching a lot in prison. Once when he talked about that, he said in a sense he likes it, because he has found that when you talk to people, particularly if they're quite young, healthy, things are going swimmingly, and then you start talking about dukkha, about suffering, the people they immediately turn away, they don't like that. And he said he has noticed in prison, the moment you talk about suffering, the people prick up their ear because they always suffer a lot. It's not a nice place to be in. And their mind is usually not in a nice place also because of the things they have done, the combination. It's immediately clear to them and they immediately get interested. So I would also look into that angle. And the Buddha hasn't even given that in the sutta, which is sometimes called transcendental dependent origination, where you have the development of dukkha and the normal sequence of dependent origination is starting from ignorance and so on. But then it flips over. Once you're reaching dukkha, that can actually lead to faith, the quality of confidence, of conviction, that the Buddha has found the way of the end of dukkha, conviction that this is a teaching which can help me, of faith and confidence that the Buddha worked with that, saw exactly the problem and could solve it. And once you have faith, then all the wholesome qualities can come. The faith never can uplift you. The next comment, when you contemplate impermanence, so you have grief, the mind is overwhelmed with the emotion of grief, and now you're contemplating impermanence, now that is the Vipassana approach, wisdom, panya. You're trying to let go through seeing impermanence with wisdom. Okay, but it may not really work. So grief is there, you contemplate and you cannot let go. So it's always important to use both samatha and vipassana. And when the mind is overwhelmed with grief, and it can be in a very contracted demotivated. Grief is usually not an energetic bright state, it's the opposite. You're depressed, down. And it's not surprising that the practice of insight is not so successful. Because usually you need this bright and radiant mind to really have good insight. So I would also try to use more like samatha meditation objects, which are immediately uplifting for the mind. Like contemplation of the Buddha. And they will also distract you more. The metta, and maybe even better, karuna. May all beings be free from pain. May all beings be free from suffering. May all beings be healed. Or simply in the Itipiso Bhagava Adahang Samma Sambuddho 108 times. Talking about YouTube, you can just put in Itipiso 108 times. We'll have it on YouTube. Then spend some time, pick your favorite version. Now they have this beautiful, in Singapore I think they did that, a Namo Tassa with a melody. Have you ever heard that one? Namo Tassa. This is quite melodious and with instruments, not so much for monks, but in lay life. And the music can be uplifting as well when your mind is very, very, very dark. Then you have this beautiful combination of the meaning of Namo Tassa. You can chant it like a mantra, and some music may also be positive. Or you go for the 108 times. Because now recollecting the Buddha, developing loving kindness, developing compassion, that is immediately uplifting. If you try to contemplate it on the inside angle, the problem is that you may actually go deeper into the grief because you're focusing on the grief in a sense. And if your mind can't handle the wisdom and the insight yet, and you may just end up, as you said, you get more anxious when you contemplate. I may lose all the other relatives. That is not the intention of, it's not the right application of that meditation. So I would occasionally try also for the simple purpose that it distracts you. While you're doing the Itipiso, particularly if you have a beautiful YouTube video, sometimes they also give you beautiful, inspiring images of the Buddha, which you can watch at the same time, and that will uplift your mind. And after that has happened, then you can already see the impermanence of mind states. And I would recommend to do the contemplation of impermanence more internally. That all these emotions can never last forever. And have patience with you. Now, if you're, for example, losing a mother, unless you're a super advanced practitioner and have already in the stages of enlightenment or profound samadhi, it will take considerable time. Just allowing to heal gradually. So first of all, don't blame yourself. It's nothing wrong with you. Even as a Buddhist, you're overwhelmed by grief. This can be the case. You just acknowledge it. This is his emotion. Because if you just fight it, doesn't acknowledge it, will not really work. And then immediately reminding yourself, it will never last forever, cannot. You acknowledge again, it feels like this is forever. It feels like, no, I don't come out of that. But you immediately challenge that, because you know from all the past that all these emotions never last forever. And then there's some good uplifting samatha objects. Not so much, I wouldn't recommend breath meditation. Because the danger is you think you're watching the breath. The breath is so subtle that your mind doesn't focus on that, but it goes more into the grief. You may not even notice that, because the grief is so strong, you cannot focus on something so subtle as this little bit of sensation from breathing. And then you're sitting there, and what you're really doing is getting Wong Samadhi on the grief. So I would rather use something like a mantra. Either recollection of the Buddha, or metta or karuna, compassion. And now I would use YouTube, put that on, go and then chant along. Because if you chant on your own, you may not feel enough motivation. The grief makes a very low energy. But if you put that on, a good quality, maybe even some inspiring image which they play at the same time, and then you chant along. And you do a little Buddha puja. And in particular, the faith, saddha. Now you finally have a really good idea of what the Buddha set out and what he has found the way to get out of. And just imagine that there is a state, a realization available which we can get, where you can never possibly ever experience that ever again. And then reminding ourselves that there are countless disciples of the Buddha who have realized that, and who will be free from that pain forever. And that although you can't do it yet, that one day you develop the faith, the confidence, that if you follow the path of the Buddha, then you can reach that same stage, where that pain can never ever get you again.